Hi, I'm Romila Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In August 1947, she was 15. What did independence mean to her? What were her dreams and expectations, and were they realized? And today, what sort of country does she think India has become, and does she like it? Those are some of the issues I shall raise today with someone who's widely considered India's foremost historian, Romila Thapar. Romila Thapar, in 47 you were just 15. What did independence mean to you? What were your dreams and expectations?
I regarded myself and my generation as having grown up on what I always refer to as the cusp of independence. So there were immense expectations. The expectations were largely one of the imminence of something exciting that was going to change our society and make us into a new people from what we had been as colonized subjects. So there was tremendous excitement. Excitement of a kind that drew in contemporary events and one's thoughts about them. It was my last year in school. But we were a bunch of people, as many people of my age, who the moment school was over and homework was done, and fortunately in those days one didn't have too much homework, we would rush to Gandhi's prayer meetings. Every time he came out of jail, he held a prayer meeting, and we would rush there and listen and chat amongst ourselves about, did we really understand what he was saying? What was he saying? What was it like? And so on. And then there was this big event in school when I was told on the 15th of August we're going to celebrate the independence of India. And so there will be a meeting of the entire school, the parents, well-wishers, friends, everybody, a huge gathering. And the prefects, of which I happen to be one, will plant a sapling, will bring down the Union Jack and put up the Indian flag. And that was a tremendously emotional moment for all of us, the change of flags. And then I was told I must make a little speech. And I was terrified. What was I going to say? And there were all these people there whom I didn't know. And I ran around in circles for 2 weeks asking everybody, what shall I say? What shall I say? And then one of my teachers, who happened to be the history teacher, said to me, look, you're discussing all these issues amongst yourselves. Doesn't matter whether they're sensible or what. Just get up and say, this is what we've been talking about. So I sat down and wrote my little speech, and it began with the usual cliche quotation from Wordsworth. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And we were all very conscious of the fact that we were young and we were the inheritors of something that was going to be new and thrilling and was going to change our lives.
So a new world was opening for the young Romila.
A new world was opening. And one had immense expectations. The one word that kind of sums it up is what were the slogans that we were shouting? And now when I think of it, it's ironic. Inqilab Zindabad, Azadi. Azadi was the commonest slogan that everybody was shouting. There was nothing anti-national about
But
it.
at 15, those slogans had particular deep meaning for you.
Oh yes, it had the meaning of not just freedom for the country and independence.
But freedom
yes.
for me.
Freedom for me to do what I want to do.
So it was a coming of age.
It was a coming of age. In many ways.
75 years ago, in contrast to your sense of coming of age, many in the world thought India wouldn't survive as a united country. And the truth is, we had challenges of caste, creed, ethnicity, region, language, cuisine. What were the strengths and what were the qualities that India found in itself that defied the doubters? Why did we survive united for 75 years?
Well, I would think of three things. One is we were a very mixed bunch of people. In school, for example, I was trying to remember the other day the names of all my close friends, people I moved around with everywhere. So there was Leela Bhandari, good Khatri Punjabi, Prabha Moite, a good Maharashtrian woman, Zia Sayed, the daughter of a tradesman from the city, Katie Shroff, the daughter of a Parsi entrepreneur, Margaret Kurpale, who was an Anglo-Indian, whose father predictably was in the railway service, and Gillian Coleman, who was the daughter of a British officer working in the civil service. In fact, Gillian was the first person who taught me all about jazz. This was a completely mixed up bunch of people. We were in and out of each other's houses. We were talking to each other as if we all knew each other, not just superficially.
Was this the strength of India, that different people could mingle together and be friends?
Absolutely. They were my closest friends, and I kept up a correspondence with at least three of them until a couple of years ago.
So India's diversity wasn't its weakness, it was its strength.
It was its strength. And I think that, we've misunderstood a lot of the Indian tradition by making it single, monopolistic, and so on. It's that spread, it's that plurality which is really very effective. I know it's a cliche to say we had plurality, but we must define it in terms of the plurality of living together.
And
the
this is what the world didn't understand. When they predicted
yeah.
India would fall apart,
Yeah.
they didn't realize that actually plurality, diversity, heterogeneity were India's strengths, not
Yeah.
its fracture points.
Yeah, because there's always place for something. I mean, religion wasn't monolithic. It was a whole series of sects that were attributed to various religious movements.
And they all could live happily together.
And they could live happily together, or they could live unhappily, but it would be at the level of the sect. There was no such thing as an all India religious organization.
Which is why it didn't threaten the unity of the country. Today it's become fashionable to decry and denigrate Nehru in India, but almost 90% of the people who do it have no idea what Nehru in India was like. And yet, those were your formative years.
Absolutely.
How do you remember Nehru in India?
Well, first of all, the feeling that one could do things if one tried. So we were all, in a sense, I hate to use that word, but we were all, in a sense, pioneers. I remember when I finished my PhD in London and I was coming back to India, somebody said to me, I suppose you'll now chase after a job in Delhi University. And I said, no, I'd like to go to a new university. Why a new university? I said, try out new ideas, try out new ways of writing history.
So the first quality of Nehru in India is that it was a pioneer age.
It was a pioneer age. And one saw it in everything he did. I mean, for one thing, of course, he was a very dignified politician. We've never had a prime minister that was so dignified.
Did you admire him?
I guess so. I'm not given to admiring people too
But for
much.
the young 15-year-old Romila,
He was certainly an icon. There's no question.
And he had a particular style about him with the rosebud in his lapel.
That. And more than that, he was a man of dignity, and he was somebody who was, for me, very attractive. He was well read, and he reflected on his readings, and he had written up his reflections. Now, this really put him apart from the run-of-the-mill. And sometimes I joke about it, and I say, politicians do very well when they're put in jail for long periods, because they can read and write and talk to others.
He had spent 10 years in jail under the British.
Absolutely. And this was a great sort of outcome.
So Nehru was someone Romila Thapar in her teens and early 20s looked up to and admired.
Yeah. Let me give you a little anecdote about that. I never really met him, in the same way as even my meeting with Gandhi was momentary. He spoke one sentence and I said, yes, of course, Gandhi, my life didn't change, but still. I met him briefly somewhere. There was a students' organization in Delhi that hosted a reception, and a whole lot of us, 28 of us or whatever it was, were introduced to him. We said namaste, that was it. Then someone said to me, when my book on Ashoka came out, someone said to me, he's very interested in that subject of history. Why don't you send him a copy? And I said, I don't like sending copies of my books to politicians. I mean, they won't read them. And they said, no, he's different. So after much persuasion, I sent him a copy of the book with a little note saying, I know you won't have time to read it, but in case you're interested. Blow me, the next week I got a letter back from him saying, thank you for sending the book. I'm very interested in the subject, and I see that you've also done a translation of the edicts and so on. I hope I will in the near future have time to read it, and if so, I will send you my comments. Yours sincerely, Jawaharlal Nehru. And I thought to myself, which Prime Minister would have the courtesy to write back to a young student, a young teacher starting off in her profession, and say, thank you for sending me your book?
Let's at this point come to politicians, because India, as you know, is a very political country. The discourse in our country is dominated by politics. So let me start by asking you, how much does India today, the sort of country that we've become, owe to its first Prime Minister? How much does the fact that we've survived and succeeded as a democracy owe to Jawaharlal Nehru?
I would say that the foundations that he laid have kept us going. Not the superstructure, but the foundations. What do I mean by that? He was concerned with the definition of nationalism, which everybody has, that it's secular, it's democratic, and there is a certain nationalist position. It's secular because he was the one person who insisted that religion mustn't come in the way of politics. The two have to be, and quite sensibly so. I mean, religion is a great thing. It's a matter of faith, belief. It's a matter of one's psychological instincts. It shouldn't come into politics at all. But he was firm on that. So much so that when the Somnath temple was being rebuilt, and everybody was rushing around to do a puja and whatever was required, Rajendra Prasad was asked as President of India to come and do the inaugural puja.
And Nehru objected.
Nehru objected. Prasad still went. And Nehru's comment was that sometimes I think I am the only secular person in this country.
So would you go so far to say that the fact that we were for 40, 50 years a secular country, that we were democratic, that we were tolerant of dissent, that we had a free press, all of that, in a sense, is owed to Jawaharlal Nehru?
Yes. I mean, even democracy, for example. There was this huge debate, I remember, on adult franchise, where people said you cannot have adult franchise because you can't have people who are not educated or people who are not sufficiently qualified. And he said nothing doing. A citizen is a citizen. And what did it do? It opened up the vote, particularly to women and to Dalits, the Avarna category, those outside caste.
Nehru was one critical phase in our 75 years. Another was the emergency of Indira Gandhi from 75 to 77. As you view it, was it an aberration, or was it, given India's inherent contradictions, inevitable?
Actually, I would say neither of those, because what triggered off the emergency, apart from whatever inclinations Mrs. Gandhi and Sanjay may have had, what triggered it off was a judgment. And I don't think people give enough attention to how crucial that judgment was.
To her career?
To her career and to democracy in the country.
So the judgment that threatened her career was the reason why Indian democracy was derailed for 2 years?
I wouldn't say it was the reason, but it had a lot to do with why democracy was derailed by the emergency.
One woman under threat of her career decided that the way to repair the damage to herself was at the cost of India's democracy.
That's putting it in a very extreme way, but roughly, yes. I think there's an element of that, there's a strong element of that, which has not been given enough attention.
Was India embarrassed by the emergency? You were, by then, I suspect, in your 40s. Were we an embarrassed country? Did we feel?
We were embarrassed, yes. Again, if I may be permitted an anecdote. We were embarrassed because, for example, within days of the emergency, the British newspaper, The Guardian, had a full-page advertisement saying the emergency was completely undemocratic and unrequired, signed by British intellectuals, the whole clue. And the government of India wished to reply. There was that concern. What is the world thinking of us? So they drafted a reply, and I remember receiving a copy of the draft, and there was no way in which I was going to sign it. And that led to further troubles in my life, but nevertheless.
But we did at least in those days care what the world thought about us.
Very much so.
India's image and people appreciating what we were doing was important to us.
Yeah, it was important.
The third phase in our 75 years, I suppose, is the rise of Narendra Modi and his Hindutva and Hindu nationalism. Do you view it as a decisive break with the preceding 67 years, or do you see it as a realization of India's inner identity?
You know, one has to then define India's inner identity, and far be it from me to attempt a definition of that. It's much too complicated. But to go back to nationalism, what did nationalism mean to us soon after independence? It meant secularism, democracy, and the concept of a nation state. Secularism meant that religion was not to interfere in politics. The coexistence of religions, yes, but there was to be an equality of religions, and religion was not supposed to interfere in politics. It has done so. Democracy meant adult franchise and the voice of every citizen to be represented.
And I presume the tolerance of dissent and difference.
Yeah.
The right to disagree.
The right to disagree. All right. Certainly the right to disagree, the right to express that disagreement. Elections are seeming to give way to defections. That's not democracy. You're voted into one party because you stand for one lot of beliefs, and you move across to another party that doesn't endorse those beliefs.
It sounds as if you're suggesting that India under Modi's Hindutva and Modi's Hindu nationalism is a reversal of the ideals and cherished traditions of the preceding 67 years.
Well, it's certainly, I think, a reversal of the values, ideals that the Indian national movement for independence stood for.
So this is not a continuation, this is a break.
It's not a continuation, I see it as a break. And also, let's not forget that the big change, and here I'm speaking as a historian, but nevertheless, the big change with the coming of independence was, yes, independence, but it was a change from being a subject people. You were subject to the Raja, who called you his praja, his infants. You were subject to the colonial crown, the British crown. But you were the citizens of free India. Now, what did this change mean? It is a huge change, which I don't think we fully understood. Citizenship is a free person, is a person who has rights. And the rights are what? The rights of a citizen are to water, food, shelter, to education, to health, to employment, to social justice and social equality.
Independence and the Constitution gave us all
Gave
of that.
us that.
Let's then, in that context, talk about what the last 75 years have meant for the people of India. To begin with, let me raise you this controversial concept of a ruling class, because India clearly has one. I'm talking of leading politicians, top industrialists, stars of Bollywood, captains of the cricket team, academics, authors, whatever. Do these people, in your eyes, the ruling class, constitute the best of India? Indeed, are they even representative of India as a whole? Or is it a class that is separate from, on top of, but not connected to the rest of the country?
You see, the ruling class, the qualifier, the ruling class, automatically makes it into a small segment of the population, because the entire population doesn't rule. It rules through representatives. So the question really is that to what extent are these people representing the population?
What's your answer?
My answer is that they are creating a kind of society in which they and their likes, and I include myself in that because I'm very much a member of the middle class, which is what we're talking about in effect. We're talking about members of the middle class. Believe that they're working for the good of the country and believe that they're working for the welfare of the country.
But are they actually working in their own interests?
They're more largely working in their own interests, because the kind of welfare that one expected in 1947 as a 15-year-old, that hasn't happened. And what do I mean by that? Let me just conclude this. Two things that have really bugged us badly right through history. Caste, poverty. We have not, leave alone eradicated, we have not even marginally affected the functioning of caste as a body of power, political power, economic power, and so on. We may be trying to do that, but there's no way.
Are we trying to do it? I know we have an Adivasi president at the moment, and we're proud of the fact. I know we've had Dalit presidents, but the truth is, and you know this better than me, that India's scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are amongst the most deprived in our country. Have we done enough to wipe away their tears as Gandhi would have wanted his country to do?
No, I think we haven't at all. And remember that people like a tribal president or a Dalit president, these are tokens. With the best will in the world, you can say that these are tokens of intention, but they're not actually registering change.
So tokenism is what we've gone for rather than
the actuality. Because the actuality in this case, if we're going to be talking about changing the lives of tribals and of Dalits and so on, the actuality would be precisely bringing in laws, bringing in structures where there is no caste and where poverty is annulled.
And that we haven't done, or at least not sufficiently.
No.
You also mentioned poverty. It's often said that India is a fantastic country for the rich, the powerful, the influential, and people with contacts. But India is also a democracy, or meant to be one. What sort of country is India for the poor, for people without influence, for people without contacts? In other words, what sort of country is India for the majority of its population?
I would imagine a very difficult country. There's no guarantee from the state of fulfilling the rights of the citizen. What I just mentioned. Is there a guarantee of food and drinkable water?
Technically, there is a guarantee of food.
Technically, but actually, food, water, shelter. Absolutely no guarantee for large numbers of people. And what happened, for example, with the migrations in COVID? That's not a demonstration of advanced citizenship.
So whatever the rhetoric of governments, and I'm saying that in the plural, the ordinary poor Indian citizen is usually left on his or her own to fend with the trials of life.
Absolutely, to fend with the trials of life, to try not to give in, because you're born, you have to live your span, you have to do something to keep going.
So India is not a country for poor people.
No, certainly not.
The poor are forgotten.
The poor are forgotten, or they're sidelined, or they're not taken seriously enough.
We're talking in the context of the ruling class. It's often said that the ruling class of today is very different to the ruling class of the 50s and 60s, because today's ruling class is more representative of the people. It's more rooted in the soil of the country. Would you agree with that?
But today's ruling class is not making the fundamental changes that would be required. You see, the problem, for at least the way I see it, is if we take just these two parameters of caste and poverty, in order to decrease their ill effects, leave alone annul them, to decrease their ill effects, you have to make very major changes in the social and economic functioning of your society.
And today's ruling class is
Will not
doing
do
it.
that.
Just like the ruling class of the 50s and 60s didn't, nor is the ruling class of 2020.
I mean, when you say take away their tears that Gandhi talked of, the tears of them, what are we doing with our tribals? We're making them face the nightmare of corporates coming in and mining the very land that they're cultivating. They're insecure because they're holding on the land that they're cultivating.
But you're saying something deeper. The ruling class is letting the country down.
To that extent, yes. I mean, the ruling class should have a plan of advancing economy to the degree that poverty is reduced.
That vision is missing.
That vision is missing because that vision requires a very fundamental change of Indian society.
Let me at this point raise with you something that's happened increasingly in the last 6, 8, 10 years. It's the way history is written and interpreted and understood in our country. And you are, as I said in my introduction, possibly the foremost historian in our country. Increasingly, the period from 1200 to 1800 is viewed in terms of religion and interpreted in terms of a Hindu-Muslim divide. No doubt that accords with the ideology of the ruling establishment of the day, but as a historian who sees the writing and interpretation of history being almost turned on its head, how do you respond to this?
Now that question will set me off. So you have to give me full 5 minutes. Don't worry if I carry on. It begins with colonials coming to India saying, where is your history? And not finding the equivalent of the Greek historians, the Chinese historians, and saying, right, we have to write the history of this country. So they set out to write the history of this country. They write about many things which have come up to the surface and which we're contesting. One, James Mill, for example, writes about there are two nations in India, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation. He uses the word nation. And they are constantly in conflict. James Mill, 1817, The History of British India. That statement is repeated again and again and again by colonial writers, historians, writers, everybody. It's picked up by the Indian middle class and becomes part of the fundamentals of the history of the second millennium AD. Now, the crisis comes when 50 or so years ago, historians start saying, are you sure that this makes sense in historical terms?
In other words, was Mill right or wrong?
Was Mill right or wrong? Then you start analyzing the history of that one millennium and find that Mill was hopelessly wrong. This was not what was.
But by then we've accepted the Mill interpretation.
We've accepted the Mill interpretation. And what we are now arguing is that there was no such thing as a Hindu nation and a Muslim nation, because nationhood comes in a post-colonial phase. It doesn't go back to the past. There are no nations that belong to the earlier centuries. Secondly, where's the evidence for talking about a Hindu nation and a Muslim nation? There's nothing. If you say that the Muslims, as is said by Hindutva today, that the Muslims victimized the Hindus, and therefore we've had 1,000 years of slavery and, many dramatic statements of that kind are made. When you look at the texts and the sources, you find that there are all kinds of mixtures going on. Artisans and craftsmen repairing the Qutb Minar in Delhi have little inscriptions saying I, Bhondu, Dhondu, Hundu, Handu, all these pet names that people had, are masons who repaired this destruction over here. And we are very grateful to our god Vishwakarma for helping us. Inside the Qutb Minar.
In other words, Muslims and Hindus worked side by side on the same project.
Side by side, yeah. Or you had traders. I mean, the whole of the west coast of India, which has Khojas, Bohras, Mapilas, Nawayas, and so on, these are Arab traders who married locally and became communities of mixed religion.
Another example of this is the fact that Akbar had Hindu generals and Prithviraj Chauhan had Muslim generals. And they fought against each other, but it wasn't Hindu versus Muslim.
And only last night I was reading an interesting book on the history of the horse in India, in which it was said that the Mughals and the Rajputs, high caste Rajputs, there were 27 marriages that took place in the families of both.
So what Hindutva is doing today and has been doing for the last 6-8 years is to read back Mill's interpretation of Indian history, which was untrue in 1870 when he wrote it, but they're now reading it back 6 centuries to reinterpret the past.
I mean, what is really happening, to put it in a nutshell, is the revival of the colonial history of India by pretending that this is the indigenous history.
And that's not true.
That's not true.
Jimmy.
And this is our problem today, that the professional historian who says, but look at the evidence, is dismissed because the evidence for them doesn't exist. It's just what you make believe of the past that holds.
In other words, an ideological predilection that suits a particular group is being read into history, and as a result, history is being misinterpreted because the misinterpretation suits a political body.
You see, let me just be a little pedantic over here. The good historian today has to be aware of a huge number of sources. Texts are not the only sources. There is archaeology, there's even genetics. That's coming into the writing of history all over the world. Environmental factors, all of this. So the sources have got very much wider. The interpretations, therefore, have become much more exploratory. Was it really this that explains the change, or was it also that? And the two may be rather different, but somehow are connected. And the historian is looking for these connections. Then you come to the methods, which have changed completely. History is not a narrative of the past. History is an attempt to understand and explain what happened in the past so as to understand the present better. So you go for evidence, and it has to be reliable. You can't say, oh yes, such and such a god came and then this happened, or such and such a rishi had supernatural powers and this happened. You have to have reliable evidence. And when you talk about A and B were connected, you have to be logical in making that connection.
So you're saying that the writing of history is increasingly becoming, as you said, exploratory, which makes it more fluid. You're taking more factors and sources into account, which also means that certainty of opinion, particularly of the Mill's variety, is Hindu versus Muslim, is not possible any longer.
It's not possible. The certainty of opinion is not possible. You have to say, all of us as historians start off with the premise that this is my understanding, my generalization. But something may come along and it'll change it altogether.
So is the rewriting of history that we're seeing over the last 6-8 years simply a rewriting, or is it actually a distortion done with political motivation in mind?
Well, some of us think it's a distortion done with political motivation.
You think it's a distortion?
I think it's a distortion, and I've been heavily attacked in the worst and the most disgusting ways because I'm a woman. And, women are easy targets, especially for sexist attacks. And I've been heavily attacked, but I still maintain that the history that is being propagated as Hindutva history is not history.
In other words, what we're seeing in 2022, 2021, 2020, 75 years after independence, is actually an undoing of the history and the truth.
Yeah.
So as far as history is concerned,
It's
we're not advancing, we're regressing.
Let me qualify that and say it's a strong attempt to undo the history, because fortunately so far we do have some excellent young historians who are not buying this.
But there is an attempt being made not to further the understanding of history, but to regress it.
To formulate it in terms that they think are the correct formulation. History is becoming a catechism. You're given a question and you're given the answer. You stick with that question and you stick with that answer. Don't ask another question and don't look for another answer.
This is the stultification also of young minds.
Which is why one's so worried about the new education policy.
We're coming to the end of this interview. Let me raise with you directly the figure that, like a colossus, stands above all of us, our Prime Minister. Clearly, Mr. Modi has had an impact on India that very few of his predecessors did, with the exception perhaps of Jawaharlal Nehru. He's been Prime Minister for 8 years, he's got 2 years more, arguably he could have 5 more after that. As a historian, is there any way we can get some sense of how history will remember?
Well, yes, I mean, history, of course, or historians of the future, will explore a lot of things, and they'll dig up a lot of things which are today quietly being pushed aside. So the image that will emerge will be, if they're good historians, the image that will emerge will be a rather different image, I suspect. Not completely, but there will be nuances that will not be the same. Historians look at past figures at 2 levels. One is the human being. What kind of human being was this ruler? I mean, we do that with all our kings and queens and this, that, and the other. And the human qualities come in. And whereas with someone like Nehru, you can see the human qualities because they're palpable, they're apparent.
With Modi?
They seem to be hidden.
Deliberately?
I don't know.
Or are they missing?
Well, maybe he doesn't wish to publicize them.
But you're suggesting, if I can interpret what you said, that the man who's viewed as a colossus today might be seen by future historians as a colossus with cracked feet.
Look, everybody's got cracks. There's nobody who is a colossus without cracks.
But today those cracks in Modi aren't visible. They'll be written about in the future.
They'll be written about in the future. And let's not forget that when we talk about somebody, a politician or some public figure being a colossus, this is an imagination of publicity. People aren't colossi, no matter what position they hold.
They're just projected as.
They're projected as that. And I think that we
Which
have
suggests that colossi of their own making.
Maybe of their own liking, of their own making, how they project themselves or like to see themselves projected, how others project them.
History will see through all of that.
History will see through all of that in the sense that history doesn't believe in the domination of colossi. It believes in the working of men and women.
Again, you're suggesting history won't be kind to Mr. Modi.
Well, history is never kind to any colossus.
But coming to the end, let me ask you a personal question. You have the good fortune of having not just lived through the 75 years, but been old enough to observe it, understand it, feel it, respond to it, and react to it. Today, in 2022, do you like the sort of country? Do you personally like the sort of country Mr. Modi is making India? Look,
I like the country because I've had ample opportunities to pick up and leave. No dearth of good jobs elsewhere.
But I'm asking you...
Yeah. Why have I stayed? I've stayed because for me it's very important when I go through a security check at the airport and the guy who's doing the checking looks at my boarding pass and my identity and says, "To acha aap wohi hain?" And I say, "Kya matlab?" And he says, "Jo itihas likhti hain." And then I say to him, "Have you read anything?" And then he says, "Yes, I read this or I read that." Liked it very much. Why did you like it? It has a feel of reality to it, which other books on history I read. That is a tremendous bonding. That is a tremendous sense of being responsible for what you're doing to a public that is more than just X, Y, and Z.
And this is a perfect explanation for why Romila Thapar loves her country. But I'm asking a different question.
I know.
Do you like the country Mr. Modi is making India?
No, I don't. I don't.
You don't like Modi's India?
No, I think it's too narrow, it's too limited, it's too one-sided. It hasn't got the richness. It hasn't got the anticipation of possibilities of what could happen. It hasn't got that fantasy of the kinds of human beings we could make of ourselves.
This is Modi's India is not the dream you had when you were 15.
No, it's not.
It's the antithesis of it. It's the antithesis of it.
Yeah.
Finally, when you look at people, when you look at institutions that haven't stood up and defended the ideals of our constitution adequately, or sometimes you could say at all, that haven't done their bit to fulfill the dreams and expectations 15-year-old Romila had in 47, of those institutions, which do you blame the most? Parliament, the Election Commission, the judiciary, the media, or does it go deeper than that? Is it the Indian middle class that is increasingly enamored of Modi, Hindutva, and the vision he has of India? Which of these?
Well, I think it goes deeper, and it's the Indian middle class, because if it wasn't for the Indian middle class, you wouldn't have the weaknesses that have come into these three legs that the Constitution speaks of. But when I say the middle class, I include myself in it. I mean, I'm not staying out and saying they, all of us. And I think the basic factor has been that we, or maybe my generation, took it for granted that whatever we were aspiring to in the national movement will eventually come about. And we didn't push hard enough.
Didn't work enough.
We didn't work enough to ensure that those basics of secularism, democracy, nationalism of a nationalist kind, that these should be constantly there and should not be tampered.
So the Indian middle class is guilty of taking things for granted and not doing enough to ensure they happen.
I would say that.
Is there a sense in which the Indian middle class has let us down?
I think so. I think the Indian middle class has not been sufficiently loyal to the ideas of the new India that the Indian national movement held out.
Romila Thapar, a pleasure speaking to you.
Very nice talking to you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.